A while back I had a video reviewing my Game Boy Pocket. Now, over the years I've collected many Game Boys. I've got a Game Boy Color, a Game Boy Pocket, and I've also got something that I'm going to show you here today, which is the Game Boy Advance. Now, before I show you the Advance, I want you to take note of something. Now, I'm going to use the Game Boy Pocket for this because up until the Advance, all the Game Boys were pretty much the same overall shape and size. They may have varied in thickness and gone down in size a wee bit, well, the biggest decrease being from the Game Boy to the Game Boy Pocket. And the Game Boy Color might be a little bit bigger than the Pocket, but I don't know off the top of my head. And I don't want to waste time, going to look for it during this video. With that in mind, take a look at the position as to how one would hold the Game Boy Pocket. My hands are kind of wrapped around and they're in close. I mean, the buttons, if you can hear, the buttons are perfectly easy to get to, but after a long playing time, it's just not very good. Plus, the screen is pretty darn small. Let's compare that now to the Game Boy Advance. You can see that the Game Boy Advance has a much larger screen. Now, this is the one without the backlight, but I want you to take a look at the overall styling. Notice that it's horizontal. Now, if I go ahead and put it into my holding stance again, instead of like this, the way it was with the older Game Boys, it was like this. It's a much more comfortable position. Plus, if we take a look here at the screens, you can see the screen on the Advance is quite a bit bigger. In fact, the screen on the Color is smaller than the Pocket, which really says something when you compare the Color to the Advance. If anybody wants me to review the Game Boy Color, please let me know and I will. I'll have to take that in a separate video. I do know where it is, but I don't want to spend the time rummaging around for it because it's on top of a lot of stuff. I don't really play it that much anymore. But yeah, I got this in the year 2000 as a celebration for my promotion to high school from junior high. And one of my relatives made a comment that Nintendo should have done this thing with the bigger screen in the first place. And the reason is because of my vision. This is again the reason why I'm going for the PSP. This particular Game Boy also drove my influence for the PSP. And the reason is because I really love the design, just the overall horizontal form factor of the Game Boy Advance, as opposed to the vertical of the Game Boy Pocket. You can tell that for extended gameplay, horizontal would be a lot better, which is good because we fly every summer, and finding something to do on a 4.5-hour flight. So you get the idea. With that having been said, let's go ahead and take a tour around the unit. Around the unit. I'm tripping on my words. Well, obviously, as you can tell, we have the LCD screen, and the screen is actually pretty good. If I switch it on here, and let me make sure the volume's turned up. All right. This, by the way, was the very first game that I got with it, was the Super Mario Advance. So obviously you have an idea of your screen size. You can see it's pretty darn big. We have our directional pad over here, start and select, A and B buttons, speaker, power light. Along the top, we have, now I think these are supposed to be lanyard hooks, but they are also ports for an adapter. Oh, wait a moment, this is not the lanyard hook, I'm sorry, this is just ports for an adapter. which allows you to hook the Game Boy Advance up to your Nintendo GameCube. And we have one of those adapters, because one of our games supports that. I believe we have, it's Zelda the Minish Cap and Zelda Wind Waker. You put those two together, I think. It was either that or that Zelda Wind Waker would operate on its own, connecting the Game Boy Advance to the GameCube without a cartridge, but I could be wrong. I think it required both games. Your link cable, which has not changed from the Game Boys of the past. Now again, the Pocket has a lot of similarities to the color, so that's why I'm not going to show the color right now, but I can dedicate it to a separate video if you want. But if we take a look here, you'll see the link ports are virtually the same. No major changes here. One thing of note is that this is the very first time that Nintendo has gone ahead with the L and R trigger buttons on the Game Boy. You could think of this in a way, you could think of it as a Super Nintendo in your pocket. Along the back, you don't have much. You have your battery compartment. This takes 2 AA's. You've got your tag with all that sort of information, your barcode. And on top here is the Game Boy Advance cartridge. There we go. And like I said, this is the very first game that I got, which was Super Mario Advance. Take a look at the size of this cartridge. It's tiny. For those of you who have seen my Game Boy Pocket video, you can tell. In fact, here I'll show you. I'll go ahead and do a quick comparison here. Take a look at this. This is the Game Boy cartridge on the right and the Game Boy Advance on the left, and you can see, I mean, the Game Boy Advance cartridge is positively puny when compared to the original Game Boy or even the Game Boy Color cartridges. It's positively tiny. But other than the cartridge and the battery, there isn't much along the back. On the bottom, we have our headphone jack, volume control, and the power switch. I still think that Nintendo should have put I also have a Game Boy Advance SP, and that's the one that I play the most because of the backlight. For somebody with low vision, having a backlight really helps when it comes to portable gaming. But I wish they'd included a standard headphone jack, and I'm really disappointed that they didn't. And that's why I'm glad that I found this. I thought it disappeared, but I found it earlier. So I'm very happy that I did. So anyway, yeah, the Game Boy Advance preceded the Game Boy Advance SP. 2000 to 2003, I believe, was its lifespan. You could get this in white, purple, sort of a translucent purple, and some limited edition colors like pink or gold or something or other. I think there was also a yellow one exclusive to Japan. Anyway, this still works. It is in perfect condition, as you have seen, and I love the design. Like I said, the design of this Game Boy Advance was one of the deciding factors as to whether or not to get a PSP versus a DS, because this has a big screen and very easy to use buttons. Well, the PSP is the same way. Very big screen and very easy to use buttons. You know, but I just like the overall design. This is the type of the design that is a lot better for extended gameplay, and this comes in handy on long flights versus the vertical orientation of the previous Game Boys, where you would have your hands like almost in a knot. Well, I wouldn't say in a knot, but a lot closer together, and it would just be uncomfortable. And this is just a lot better. That was pretty much it. Any comments and questions are welcome. Again, if you want me to review the Game Boy Color, I can do that in a later video. Thank you for watching, and have a nice evening.